Welcome back. Today we're going to get into Romans 9, 10, and 11. And just to recap, we talked about how he starts out, everybody's a sinner. Talks about how we're justified. He talks about how, Jesus is the one who justifies us. Talks about our freedom from sin, deliverance, life in the Spirit. And now what we're going to get into is kind of some heavy stuff that he spends some time, Paul does, in these next couple chapters, directly addressing his audience. Again, the Jews and the Gentiles in the Roman church. And this one's interesting because there's a lot of verses in this passage that sometimes trip people up. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start off with a big picture, and then we're going to zoom in on a couple of different passages just to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what he's saying and to clarify any confusion based on what he's not saying. So Romans chapter 9, here we go. Paul starts on this lament for his own people, which is the Jewish people. Basically explaining that, the law, the revelation of God being his people was given to them. And yet, because not all of them embraced Jesus as their Messiah, that some of them are not on the end of God, of being God's children. And Paul's lamenting this. And then he goes on to this discourse about how it all worked and what it means and things that God has done over the history of God's people. And so here's where we get to some verses that have kind of tripped people up over the years. You get to verse 15. He says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. And so if we're not, understanding what he's saying, it can be easy to think is God saying that I'll be merciful to some but not others? That's what it sounds like he's saying, If any of you parents, you ever had your kids and you're like, why didn't you give him an ice cream cone and you didn't give me an ice cream cone? And so you could go through the whole list of things that person did to earn it or why that one got the ice cream last week and so now it's their turn. But sometimes as a parent, you just want to say, you know what, I'm the one that knows what's right for all of you. And if you trust me, I will make sure that I am merciful to who is, I'm going to be merciful. But here's the reality of this. God's mercy is his to give, not given on the basis of either works, which some of them were believing, or heritage, based on their being Jewish. He was quoting God's message to Moses when Moses asked, hey, God, can I see your face? And he's like, I'm the Lord. I'll have mercy on whom I have mercy. And then he says, but you can't see my face. So that's what the part that he's quoting. But what God is saying is that, his mercy is his to give. It's not anybody can earn it. And there's a lot about how God works and what he does that is just beyond our comprehension. And that's what he's saying. He's not saying that he's going to give some people mercy and not others. But what it does look like to us is that, hey, why did he set them up and not them? I sometimes find myself wondering this. I have a story where, I was born because of my mom's prayers, somewhat of a miraculous story. But I'm also aware that there are some families where they were praying and that didn't happen for them. And if you were to ask me, why did God allow that to happen? My answer is, I'm not sure, but God knows. But then he goes on to talk about Pharaoh. And he says this in verse 17, for this reason I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. And then he goes on to talk about how, in verse 22, what if God, desiring to show his wrath to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? And again, one of these verses that is wait a second, God, are you telling me that Pharaoh was a vessel made just for the sake of wrath? It kind of seemed like that, right? By looking at that verse. Here's a couple of things I want to share. Pharaoh, he was visited by Moses. Moses said, let my people go. And there were 10 things in the Exodus, them, plagues. After each plague, there's a note about Pharaoh. And does anybody know what that note is? His heart hardened. Here's an interesting thing that you notice if you look at the plagues. The first 4 plagues, Pharaoh hardens his heart. And then in the 5th plague, there's a shift. And then after that, this is the verse that Paul's quoting in Exodus 9. God's like, okay, now I'm going to harden your heart. So you see the progression? Pharaoh hardens his heart. Okay, you're obviously going to harden your heart. Now I'm going to just take it and like finish the job. He goes on to talk about the potter's wheel. Here's an interesting thing I learned about pottery. It's like when the potter is making clay, like the old spinning wheel that they used, every once in a while they would get like a stubborn piece. And they would try to like mold and shape the stubborn piece. And finally, if after multiple attempts, if the potter realized this is a lump and the lump is not going away, he's not going to just toss the whole clay. He's like, you know what? I'm going to shape this into something else. It's not what I originally was starting to form it into, but it's obviously shown me that it's not going to conform to what I'm doing. So I'm going to take this vessel and turn it into something else other than what I originally started making it. I don't know what that does to your theology, but this is what Paul is saying. He's saying this is like, God's wrath is a response to our response to him. So it's like, so there was sin, Pharaoh hardened his heart, and God's like, all right, you're going to harden your heart, you're not going back? Okay, I can still use you, but now I'm using you for a different purpose than just being the one to let my people go willingly. That might cause a bit of a stir in our groups, but we can definitely discuss that. But the idea of the potter and the clay is that God had started the process. The clay was not responding to the potter's work. And so God took the clay and said, I'm going to make you something different other than what was originally designed. And so this is our understanding of this particular passage in chapter 9. And then as he goes on to it, just talking about the mystery of who God's chosen and why it seems like he's chosen some and not others. He basically makes this point that because of the Jewish people's rejection of the Messiah, not all, but in general, that allowed the Gentiles to come in. If you follow Paul's missionary journeys, you know that in Acts, he would always go to a synagogue first. Like, hey, guys, I found your Messiah. Sometimes they would listen. Sometimes they were like, nope, get out of here. So on the times that he was sent out, he was like, okay, you guys won't listen? I'm going to go to the Gentiles, and now they're going to hear the gospel. And so that's the point. He's kind of following his own missions, his own journey, saying the Jews didn't accept the Messiah, so now that's opening the doors to people who ordinarily wouldn't have heard the gospel. This is where a lot of people would be inclined to say, is he talking about predestination? Is he saying that some people were chosen before and some people were just chosen to be, predamned, in other words? But he's not saying that because he still portrays that there is a response to God's mercy that we all have the opportunity to give. We'll cover that here in a minute, a little bit further. So he goes on to chapter 10. He quotes a bunch of Old Testament passages. One of the things that he's reiterating is that justification is by faith. It's not by your heritage. It's not by keeping the law. And in this context, both Jews and Gentiles are eligible to be saved. It's free. It's a free gift to all of us. And so, as you go through chapter 10, you come to this verse where this beautiful part where he says, and how will they call on him whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? Yeah, some of you know this one. And so it's like, he's going thinking about his people, but like this speaks to something we covered earlier, where it talks about, if you don't hear the gospel, you're on islands all by yourself. Are you still subject to God's judgment if you don't respond to Jesus? But this verse, we'll talk about it in our discussion, is actually more for us as believers, because how are they going to hear if we don't go? So this is a key feature of chapter 10. And he continues to quote a lot of Old Testament scriptures to prove his point about salvation is for everybody, Jews and Gentiles. Then in chapter 11, He concludes his message directly to the Jewish people, because if you're a Jewish person now, you're kind of, at this point, you're thinking, well, are you like done with us then, God? Because, you're basically saying that all the stuff we did before just doesn't seem to matter anymore. And at this point, Paul is kind of like speaking directly to that. He's like, no, he's not done with you. And he still wants to save his people. And I think that's something that a lot of people will debate and kind of go back and forth with today. There is still this idea that, God's people, the Israelites, were the ones that he chose for his Messiah. And it's still in his heart for them to all come to a knowledge of him. The goal that he was trying to say in this passage was to reassure them that God had not abandoned the original covenant. And he even uses a couple scriptures, Psalm 94:14, 1 Samuel 12:22, and Jeremiah 31:37, just to prove this point. And then he concludes this passage by talking to the Gentiles. And to sum up what he's saying to the Gentiles, again, going back to the beginning, the Jews had been in charge, they got kicked out. The Gentile believers had gotten authority in the church. Basically what he's saying is this: you guys have been given a precious gift. Don't take it lightly. Don't take it for granted. Because, and this is kind of the crazy part, the very fact that you're in meant that there was probably somebody that said no so that God could say yes to you. This is kind of like a very, very difficult passage again. But he talks about a grafting in. Verse 19, you will say branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. And he says, verse 20, that is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not be proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. In other words, I brought you in, I can take you out. So, again, that's the debate whether it's like, are we predestined and does he pre-curse other people? Well, no, there's still that element of response to God's mercy and understanding the gift that's been given to us. One quick note on that too is that we talk about grafting in. It would be rare to take an olive shoot that was wild and grafted into a plant that had been nurtured in a garden. Like that would normally not happen. They would only take other branches to graft in a vine that had been a part of the gardening process. To take it from the wild usually wouldn't work. And so what Paul is saying is like, this is rare, and this is an extraordinary privilege that you're actually here. So don't take it lightly. And that's the kind of like the challenge I think he gives to all of us is like, our salvation. We definitely understand that it's a beautiful, amazing, tremendous, miraculous gift. Romans 10:14-15. We referenced it directly, but what would this passage speak in regards to someone who never had the opportunity to hear the gospel? And what does that mean for us as our role? The idea of what had happened, what all took place in order for the Gentiles to become saved. I want to challenge us all to just take a moment and think about everything that had to line up in order for you to come to faith. And I'm not just talking about the people that God put in your life. I'm talking about you go back generations. You talk about different revivals. You talk about, different migrations of people. You talk about people in church history that were faithful to carry the word of God. How does this passage speak to us about how we should view our salvation? What does it mean if it's just such a precious, sacred gift that was miraculous and that took a lot of things to take place for us to be right here? How should we view it? God bless you. I hope you have an amazing discussion. And feel free to have some debate, but still love each other afterwards.